November 5, 2025. The marble columns of the United States Supreme Court stand against a gray Washington sky while inside, 9 justices prepare to hear what President Trump himself calls one of the most important cases in the history of our country. The courtroom is packed. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent sits in the front row, his face tense. Lawyers shuffle papers nervously. The fate of trillions of dollars hangs in the balance, along with the very question of how much power one person should have over the entire American economy. And then something extraordinary happens. For nearly 3 hours, the most powerful judges in America absolutely grill the Trump administration's top lawyer about whether the president can essentially tax the entire world without asking Congress for permission. Conservative justices, liberal justices, all of them firing questions that suggest they think Trump has gone way too far. Chief Justice Roberts himself pressing hard on whether tariffs are really just taxes that need congressional approval. Justice Barrett worried about the complete mess that could follow if they strike down these tariffs. Justice Kavanaugh questioning whether emergency powers can really be stretched this far. Meanwhile, in Omaha, Nebraska, a 94-year-old billionaire watches all of this unfold with particular interest. Warren Buffett, the Oracle of Omaha, the man who's navigated every economic crisis for the past 6 decades, has been unusually vocal about what these tariffs mean for America. Not because he's playing politics, but because he sees something deeper at stake here. Something about the very foundations of American prosperity and the institutions that have made this country the greatest wealth-creating machine in human history. What happened in that courtroom could reshape presidential power for generations. It could determine whether your groceries stay expensive, whether companies bring jobs back to America or flee to other shores, whether the stock market crashes or soars, and whether the Constitution still means what it says about who gets to tax the American people. This isn't just another Washington drama. This is about the fundamental question of whether we still have 3 branches of government or whether we're moving towards something else entirely. The Supreme Court justices seemed deeply skeptical that Trump's tariffs are legal, and that skepticism sent shockwaves through the financial markets, through corporate boardrooms, and all the way to the White House, where Trump took to Truth Social to declare that if he loses this case, it would literally destroy the United States of America. Strong words from a president who's built his entire second-term economic strategy on these tariffs, these taxes on imports that he claims will make America great again, but that his critics say are destroying American businesses and pushing the economy toward disaster. Let's talk about what these tariffs actually are, because the scale here is absolutely staggering. We're not talking about some targeted duties on steel or aluminum. Trump used something called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA for short, to impose tariffs on basically everything America imports from basically everywhere. 10% on all imports as a baseline, 25% on everything from Canada, 25% on everything from Mexico, initially 25% on China, later dropped to 20% after some negotiations, 50% on India and Syria, 100% on patented drugs. The list goes on and on. By October 31st of this year, these tariffs had brought in $223.9 billion to the U.S. Treasury. That's $142 billion more than the same time last year. Treasury Secretary Bessent said revenues could hit $300 billion by the end of 2025. We're talking about amounts of money that dwarf most government programs, collected not through any law Congress passed, but through executive orders that Trump signed by declaring various national emergencies. And here's where it gets really interesting from a constitutional perspective. IEEPA was passed in 1977 to give presidents the ability to respond to genuine national emergencies involving foreign threats. Think freezing terrorist assets after 9/11. Think sanctions on North Korea's nuclear program. Think stopping cyber attacks from hostile nations. The law was designed for real, immediate threats to national security where waiting for Congress to act could mean catastrophe. But Trump used it differently. He declared an emergency over illegal immigration and drug trafficking from Mexico and Canada. Fair enough, you might say, fentanyl is a real crisis. But then he used that emergency to slap 25% tariffs on everything from Canadian lumber to Mexican avocados. Then he declared another emergency over what he called large and persistent trade deficits with dozens of countries. And based on that, he imposed his Liberation Day tariffs on April 2nd, affecting nearly every product America imports from nearly every country on Earth. Neil Katyal, the lawyer representing the small businesses challenging these tariffs, stood before the Supreme Court and made a simple but powerful argument. He said tariffs are taxes, and under our Constitution, only Congress has the power to tax. He pointed out that the word tariff doesn't even appear in IEEP, not once. And he asked the justices to consider whether it's really believable that every president from Reagan to Obama had this massive tariff power sitting there unused, while they spent years negotiating with Congress to get trade authority. If IEEPA really gave presidents unlimited power to tax imports, why didn't anyone notice for almost 50 years? Solicitor General John Sauer, arguing for the Trump administration, painted a very different picture. He said striking down these tariffs would have catastrophic consequences for national security, foreign policy, and the economy. He argued that the president needs this flexibility to respond to threats, to negotiate with other countries, to protect American interests in a dangerous world. He warned of dangerous diplomatic embarrassment if the court pulled the rug out from under ongoing trade negotiations. But the justices weren't buying it. Even the conservative justices, the ones Trump appointed, seemed deeply troubled by the scope of what the administration was claiming. They kept coming back to basic constitutional principles. Congress has the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. Congress has the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. These aren't just technical legal points. They're fundamental to how our government is supposed to work. The major questions doctrine kept coming up during arguments, and this is crucial to understanding what's at stake. The doctrine says that when an administrative action has vast economic and political significance, Congress needs to speak clearly if it wants to delegate that power to the executive branch. These tariffs affect $4 trillion in annual imports, 14% of the entire U.S. economy. The government itself claims they'll generate between $2.3 and $3.3 trillion over the budget window. Can a president really restructure the entire American economy based on vague language in a 50-year-old law that was meant for freezing terrorist bank accounts? Meanwhile, let's talk about Warren Buffett, because his perspective on all this is fascinating and deeply revealing. Here's a man who's built one of the world's largest companies, Berkshire Hathaway, by betting on American businesses for 6 decades. He's seen wars, recessions, inflation, deflation, bubbles, crashes, and every kind of economic crisis imaginable. And he's consistently made money through all of it by trusting in American institutions and the rule of law. Buffett has been uncharacteristically outspoken about these tariffs. At Berkshire's annual meeting in May, with thousands of shareholders gathered in Omaha, he didn't mince words. Trade should not be a weapon, he said to thunderous applause. He called tariffs an act of war to some degree, pointing out that they've led to bad things throughout history. The attitudes they bring out, the economic nationalism, the zero-sum thinking that your gain must be my loss, these are dangerous forces that can spiral out of control. But here's what's really interesting about Buffett's position. He's not just worried about the immediate economic impact, though Berkshire's own quarterly reports note considerable uncertainty from the tariffs and their potential for adverse consequences across the company's vast array of businesses. What really concerns him is the breakdown of institutional norms, the idea that a president can essentially impose massive taxes on the American people without going through Congress. Buffett made a joke that captures the absurdity of the situation perfectly. He said the tooth fairy doesn't pay these tariffs. American consumers do. American businesses do. When you make imports more expensive, that cost gets passed on to everyone who buys things, which is everyone. And then what? Buffett asks. You always have to ask that question in economics. And then what happens? Inflation accelerates. Other countries retaliate with their own tariffs. Trade wars escalate. Global supply chains break down. Economic growth slows. Jobs disappear. During a CBS interview, Buffett was even more direct. He said tariffs over time are a tax on goods, laughing as he delivered the tooth fairy line. But his laughter had an edge to it, the kind of nervous energy you get when you're watching something you know is going to end badly but you're powerless to stop it. When pressed about the state of the economy, Buffett said it was the most interesting subject in the world, but then refused to elaborate, knowing that his words move markets and not wanting to cause panic. The lower courts have already ruled against Trump, and their reasoning is worth understanding because it shows just how far outside normal bounds these tariffs really are. The Court of International Trade, which specializes in trade law, issued a unanimous ruling in May that the tariffs were illegal. They found that IEEPA doesn't authorize tariffs at all, and even if it did, using it this way would be an unconstitutional delegation of Congress's exclusive power to tax. The court pointed out that President Nixon had used similar emergency powers back in 1971, but his tariffs were explicitly limited by rates already established in law. Trump's tariffs have no such limits. They're whatever he says they are, for as long as he wants them to be, on whatever products he chooses. That's not emergency power, that's dictatorial power, at least in the economic realm. Then the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals heard the case, and in August, they affirmed that the tariffs were illegal in a 7-4 decision. The majority opinion was scathing. They said the president had departed from established tariff schedules and imposed varying tariffs of unlimited duration on imports of nearly all goods from nearly every country. They said this wasn't regulation of trade, it was rewriting the entire trade system without congressional authorization. 4 judges dissented, arguing that IEPA's text does give the president broad authority to regulate importation during emergencies and that courts shouldn't second-guess the president's foreign policy judgments, but even they acknowledged this was an unprecedented use of emergency powers, something no previous president had attempted in the nearly 50 years since IEEPA was enacted. What makes this even more dramatic is what Judge Taranto wrote in dissent. He argued that IEEPA embodies an eyes-open congressional grant of broad emergency authority in the foreign affairs realm. But think about what that means. If he's right, then Congress essentially gave away its most fundamental power, the power to tax, through vague language about regulating imports during emergencies. Is that really what the founders intended when they carefully divided power among 3 branches of government? The businesses challenging these tariffs aren't giant corporations with armies of lawyers. They're small companies like V.O.S. Selections, a wine importer, Fish USA, which sells fishing equipment, Terry Precision Cycling, which makes bike components. These are exactly the kinds of businesses that Trump says he's trying to protect, but they're being crushed by his tariffs. Some face bankruptcy. Others have had to lay off workers or cancel expansion plans. Rick Muscat, who runs a company that makes educational toys, has paid more than $50,000 in additional tariffs under Trump's trade policy. That's 10% of his company's entire profits. He says his wholesalers and retailers won't accept price increases, and he can't absorb lower margins forever. So what's his solution? Automation. He's going to replace workers with machines because that's the only way to cut costs enough to survive the tariffs. This is the exact opposite of what Trump says he wants to achieve. Melkon Khosrovian, who co-founded Green Bar Distillery in Los Angeles, tells a similar story. His company bottles cocktails and liqueurs, creating jobs in America. But the tariffs on imported spirits and ingredients are killing his business. If we could get our tariff money back, he says, that would be great. But he has strong reservations that they'll ever see a penny, even if the Supreme Court rules in their favor. Over 700 small businesses signed an amicus brief opposing the tariffs. They're part of something called the We Pay the Tariffs Coalition, which is trying to counter Trump's narrative that foreign countries pay these taxes. Dan Anthony, the coalition's executive director, points out there have been more than 40 changes to the tariff code this year alone. The unpredictability is paralyzing, he says. Small business owners can't plan, can't invest, can't grow when they don't know what their costs will be from one month to the next. The potential remedies if the Supreme Court strikes down the tariffs are mind-boggling in their complexity. Treasury Secretary Bessent warned in a court filing that the government might have to refund between $750 billion and $1 trillion if the court waits until next summer to rule the tariffs illegal. Think about that number for a second. $1 trillion in potential refunds. That's more than the entire defense budget. It's more than we spend on Social Security in a year. But even if businesses are entitled to refunds, actually getting that money back could be a nightmare. Joyce Adatutu, a trade lawyer at Vinson & Elkins, warns this will be a huge paperwork burden. Some shipments have thousands of products, some subject to IEEPA tariffs, some not. Untangling all of that, processing millions of refund claims, could take years and cost billions just in administrative expenses. The timing of all this matters enormously. The Supreme Court heard arguments on November 5th. They're being asked to rule quickly because of the massive economic uncertainty these tariffs are creating. But quick for the Supreme Court could still mean months. In the meantime, businesses have to keep paying the tariffs, keep making decisions without knowing if those tariffs will exist next month or next year. And here's where it gets really interesting strategically. The Trump administration isn't sitting around waiting for the court to rule. They're already working on backup plans. According to Bloomberg, both the Commerce Department and the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative are studying fallback options. They're looking at Section 301 of the Trade Act, which grants some unilateral tariff authority. They're examining Section 122, which allows limited tariffs to address balance of payments problems. They're preparing to reimpose tariffs under different authorities the moment the Supreme Court strikes down the IEEPA tariffs. This reveals something important about Trump's approach to governance. He's determined to impose these tariffs one way or another, regardless of what courts say, regardless of what Congress wants, regardless of the economic damage they might cause. In his Truth Social post about the case, he wrote that if a president is not allowed to use tariffs, we will be at a major disadvantage against all other countries throughout the world. He sees tariffs not as one tool among many, but as the essential foundation of his entire economic strategy. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick went even further in a CNN interview. He dismissed Buffett's concerns as silly and argued that tariffs could replace the need for the Internal Revenue Service entirely. He claimed, incorrectly, that the IRS was created when we entered World War I, and that before that, America only had tariffs. This is historically wrong on multiple levels, but it reveals the administration's fantasy of returning to some imagined golden age when the federal government was funded entirely by import taxes. The international implications of this case are enormous and underappreciated. If the Supreme Court strikes down the tariffs, what happens to Trump's negotiations with China, where he claims the threat of tariffs brought them to the table? What about the framework deals he says he's already negotiated based on tariff threats? Foreign governments are watching this case closely, trying to figure out whether American tariff threats are real or whether they should just wait for courts to intervene. There's also the question of retaliation. Other countries have already imposed counter tariffs on American goods in response to Trump's measures. If the Supreme Court strikes down the U.S. tariffs, but other countries keep their retaliatory measures in place while legal proceedings drag on, American exporters could face the worst of both worlds. No protection at home but barriers abroad. The Federal Reserve is caught in an impossible position. Fed Chairman Jerome Powell has warned that tariffs could fuel inflation and has resisted Trump's calls to cut interest rates to offset the tariffs' economic damage. Trump has publicly called for Powell's removal, but the Fed chair serves a fixed term and can't simply be fired at presidential whim. This conflict between monetary and trade policy is creating additional uncertainty in financial markets. Let's zoom out and look at what this means for ordinary Americans, because ultimately, that's what matters most. If you're someone with a retirement account, a 401k, a pension, your financial future is directly affected by this case. The stock market has been volatile all year, partly because investors can't figure out whether these tariffs will stand or fall. Companies exposed to international trade have seen their valuations swing wildly as the legal proceedings advance. If you work in manufacturing, retail, agriculture, or any industry that depends on imports or exports, your job security is on the line. Some companies are hiring based on the assumption that tariffs will protect them from foreign competition. Others are laying off workers because the tariffs make their business models unviable. Still others are frozen, unable to make any major decisions until they know what the rules will be. And if you're just someone who buys things, which is everyone, you're paying more because of these tariffs. The budget lab at Yale University estimated that all 2025 U.S. tariffs plus foreign retaliation lower real GDP growth by 0.5 percentage point each year. That might not sound like much, but compounded over time, it means the economy is hundreds of billions of dollars smaller than it would be without the tariffs. The constitutional implications go far beyond trade policy. This case is really about the fundamental structure of American government. The founders created 3 co-equal branches for a reason. They didn't want any single person or faction to have too much power. They specifically gave Congress the power to tax because taxation without representation was one of the core grievances that led to the American Revolution. Over the decades, especially since World War II and accelerating after 9/11, we've seen a steady expansion of presidential power. Presidents of both parties have pushed the boundaries, using national security and emergency powers to bypass Congress on everything from military interventions to domestic surveillance. But imposing taxes without congressional approval would be a new frontier, a bridge too far even in our age of imperial presidency. There are interesting historical parallels here. During the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt tried to reshape the American economy through executive action, and the Supreme Court pushed back hard. They struck down key parts of his program, saying Congress had delegated too much power to the president. FDR was furious. He even tried to pack the court with additional justices who would vote his way. But ultimately, the court's resistance forced him to work with Congress to build coalitions, to govern through democratic processes rather than executive fiat. The current Supreme Court faces a similar moment. They have to decide whether to let Trump essentially rewrite American trade policy unilaterally or whether to force him to work with Congress. Given the partisan gridlock in Washington, forcing Trump to get congressional approval for his tariffs might mean they never happen at all. Congress can barely pass a budget, let alone comprehensive trade legislation. But that's not the court's problem to solve. Their job is to interpret the law and the Constitution, not to make policy or worry about practical consequences. As Justice Barrett noted during oral arguments, the potential for a complete mess if they strike down the tariffs isn't a reason not to do it if that's what the law requires. Some legal scholars argue the court might try to split the baby, finding some tariffs legal and others not. They might say tariffs directly related to drug trafficking are okay, but tariffs based on trade deficits aren't. Or they might uphold the president's authority to impose temporary emergency tariffs, but require congressional approval for anything permanent. But partial victories rarely satisfy anyone, and such a ruling could create even more confusion and litigation. The smart money seems to be betting on the tariffs being struck down in some form. During oral arguments, even justices typically sympathetic to executive power seemed troubled by the scope of what Trump was claiming. But Supreme Court predictions are notoriously unreliable. Sometimes justices ask tough questions to test arguments they ultimately accept. Sometimes they change their minds during deliberations. What's certain is that this case will have profound consequences regardless of how it's decided. If the court upholds the tariffs, it will represent a massive expansion of presidential power, essentially giving future presidents the ability to tax imports at will by declaring emergencies. If they strike them down, it could cripple Trump's economic agenda and force a fundamental reconsideration of how America engages with the global economy. Warren Buffett's perspective on all this is worth returning to because he sees these issues with unusual clarity. At 94, He's witnessed the full arc of American power in the 20th and 21st centuries. He's seen America rise to global dominance through trade and openness, not through walls and tariffs. He's built his fortune betting on American companies that succeed in global markets. When Buffett says tariffs are an act of war, he's not being hyperbolic. He's remembering the 1930s, when the Smoot-Hawley tariffs helped turn a recession into the Great Depression and contributed to the economic nationalism that led to World War II. He's thinking about the post-war order that America built based on free trade and international cooperation, which has produced the greatest period of prosperity in human history. But Buffett's real insight is about institutions. In interview after interview, he's emphasized that he invests in America because of its strong institutions. Courts that enforce contracts, regulators who maintain fair markets, a Congress that, however dysfunctional, still represents the people. These institutions, not any particular policy or president, are what make America a safe place to invest and build wealth over the long term. When those institutions break down, when one branch of government accumulates too much power, when the rule of law becomes the rule of whoever's in charge, that's when countries decline. That's when capital flees. That's when economies stagnate. Buffett has seen it happen around the world, and he's warning that it could happen here if we're not careful. The oral arguments revealed another crucial dimension of this case that hasn't gotten enough attention. Multiple justices asked about the administrative capacity to actually implement and potentially unwind these tariffs. Justice Barrett's question about whether refunds would be a complete mess wasn't just about paperwork. It was about whether the government even has the ability to manage economic policy of this scope and complexity without congressional authorization and oversight. Think about what these tariffs actually require in terms of implementation. Customs and Border Protection has to track thousands of different products from hundreds of countries, each potentially subject to different tariff rates that can change at presidential whim. Importers have to navigate constantly shifting rules, file protests, seek exclusions, potentially claim refunds. The entire system is straining under the weight of executive orders that were never contemplated when our trade infrastructure was designed. This administrative chaos is a feature, not a bug, of rule by executive order. When Congress passes trade legislation, it typically includes implementation timelines, transition periods, clear definitions, dispute resolution procedures, and funding for administration. When a president just declares tariffs by emergency proclamation, none of that infrastructure exists. The result is confusion, uncertainty, and enormous costs for both government and business. There's also the question of democratic accountability. When Congress passes a tax, voters can hold their representatives accountable. They can vote them out if they don't like the policy. But when a president imposes tariffs unilaterally, especially when those tariffs are framed as national security measures that can't be questioned, democratic accountability breaks down. Citizens are taxed without meaningful representation, exactly what the founders sought to prevent. As we wait for the Supreme Court's decision, American businesses are stuck in an impossible position. They can't plan for a future where tariffs exist, because they might be struck down. They can't plan for a future without tariffs, because they might be upheld or reimposed under different authorities. This uncertainty is its own form of economic damage, separate from whatever the tariffs themselves cost. Some companies are pursuing a hedging strategy, maintaining duplicate supply chains, one for a tariff world and one for a free trade world. But that's expensive and inefficient, exactly the kind of economic waste that trade is supposed to eliminate. Other companies are simply pulling back, delaying investments, postponing hiring, waiting to see what happens. That hesitation, multiplied across the economy, becomes a drag on growth that could tip us into recession. The international dynamics are equally complex and troubling. China has actually benefited in some ways from Trump's chaotic tariff policy. While Chinese goods face high tariffs, the fact that Trump has also hit allies like Canada, Mexico, India, and Europe means China's relative disadvantage has decreased. Companies that might have moved production from China to India are staying put because Indian goods now also face significant tariffs. Meanwhile, other countries are forming new trade partnerships that exclude the United States. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership in Asia, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the European Union's deals with Mercosur and others, these agreements are creating a new global trade architecture that roots around American protectionism. Once these patterns are established, they're hard to reverse, even if America later decides to rejoin the global trading system. Looking ahead, the Supreme Court has several options, each with profound implications. They could strike down all IEEPA tariffs immediately, creating chaos but forcing Congress to act. They could strike them down but stay their ruling to give Congress time to respond. They could uphold some tariffs but not others, creating a complex patchwork of what's legal and what's not. They could uphold everything, essentially giving presidents unlimited power to tax imports during self-declared emergencies. Or they could do something unexpected, perhaps ruling on narrow procedural grounds that leaves the fundamental questions unresolved. Courts often prefer to avoid constitutional showdowns when possible, and there might be ways to resolve this case without directly addressing whether IEEPA authorizes tariffs. But given the economic stakes and the clear conflict between branches of government, it's hard to see how the court avoids the core issues. Whatever the court decides, we're already seeing the consequences of governing by emergency declaration rather than democratic legislation. Trust in institutions is eroding. Business confidence is shaken. International relationships are fraying. The economy is underperforming its potential. These costs accumulate slowly, almost invisibly, but over time they compound into national decline. Warren Buffett understands this dynamic better than most. That's why, despite his general optimism about America, he's been selling stocks and building cash reserves. Berkshire Hathaway's cash pile has reached record levels, not because Buffett thinks the world is ending, but because he's having trouble finding good investments in an environment of such profound uncertainty. When one of history's greatest investors can't figure out how to deploy capital productively, that's a warning sign we should all take seriously. As we approach the court's decision, it's worth remembering what's really at stake here. This isn't just about trade policy or economic growth, though those matter enormously. It's about whether we remain a constitutional republic where power is divided and checked, or whether we're evolving into something else, something more like the strongman governments that have failed throughout history. The founders knew that concentrated power corrupts, that even well-intentioned leaders become tyrants when there are no constraints on their authority. They designed our system to be inefficient, to require compromise and coalition building, to make it hard for any one person or faction to impose their will on everyone else. That inefficiency is frustrating, especially in times of crisis, but it's also our greatest protection against tyranny. President Trump sees these constraints as obstacles to be overcome rather than safeguards to be respected. His use of emergency powers to impose tariffs is just one example of a broader pattern of trying to govern through executive action rather than democratic legislation. Whether you support his policies or oppose them, you should be concerned about the precedent being set, because once these powers are claimed, they rarely get given back, and the next president might use them for purposes you don't support. The Supreme Court now holds in its hands not just the fate of Trump's tariffs, but the future balance of power in American government. Their decision will reverberate for generations, either reinforcing the constitutional constraints that have served us well for nearly 250 years, or opening the door to a new era of executive supremacy that the founders would hardly recognize. As investors, business owners, workers, and citizens, we're all waiting to see what comes next. Will the court have the courage to say no to presidential overreach, even if it means economic disruption in the short term? Will they uphold the Constitution's allocation of powers, even if it makes governing harder? Will they protect the institutions that Warren Buffett rightly identifies as the foundation of American prosperity? We'll know soon enough. The court has promised an expedited decision though expedited in Supreme Court terms, could still mean months of waiting. In the meantime, the uncertainty continues, the economic damage accumulates, and the constitutional questions grow more urgent. This is what happens when we try to govern through emergency declarations rather than democratic processes, when we treat the Constitution as an obstacle rather than our foundation, when we forget that concentrated power is always dangerous, no matter who wields it. The story isn't over. Whatever the court decides, there will be appeals, legislative responses, new executive orders, more litigation. The fight over presidential power and constitutional limits will continue long after this case is decided. But this moment, this case, this decision will be remembered as a turning point, either toward constitutional restoration or toward something darker and more dangerous. If you've made it this far, you understand that this isn't just another political fight or economic dispute. This is about the fundamental nature of American government and whether the constitutional constraints that have protected our liberty and prosperity for centuries still have meaning. Pay attention to what comes next. Your future, and your children's future, depends on it. If this deep dive into the constitutional and economic implications of the Supreme Court's tariff case opened your eyes to what's really at stake, make sure you subscribe to Oracle Vision for more analysis that goes beyond the headlines. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss our coverage of the court's decision when it comes. And remember, in times of uncertainty, knowledge is your best investment. Like this video if it helped you understand these complex issues, and share it with others who need to know what's really happening in Washington and on Wall Street. This is Oracle Vision, keeping you informed when it matters most.